Hi, hello, I'm Sam Harrison. I read, review and discuss fantasy and science fiction books. And today we have a discussion on something that is truly plaguing the bookish internet, the bookish industry, booktube, book readers, book people everywhere. And that is how to categorise your books. So obviously, genre is an incredibly important way to categorise books. Genre can help you know whether a book will contain the kinds of storytelling and ideas that you're looking for. So for example, I pretty much exclusively on this channel will cover science fiction and fantasy. I will also cover horror books. I have some thriller books actually that I like, crime thriller books that I've been wanting to read forever, and I think I will pepper in a few of those next year. Primarily though, this channel is about science fiction and fantasy. And even more primarily than that, I would say that actually this channel is more about fantasy because the main big event content on the channel is fantasy. And that main event content is things like My Wheel of Time read along, the Wandering Inn read along. Both of those are regular series on the channel that are tied to fantasy, whereas there isn't really anything like that for sci-fi. So I was planning on working my way through The Expanse as like my sci-fi read along, but the problem that I had with that is I started and I just didn't get on with the first couple of chapters of The Expanse and decided to shelve it for when I was in a better mood and more craving sci-fi. But what we're here to talk about today is not genre, is not the content that I'm making on the channel. It is an extremely important issue, which is whether a book is doey or thinky. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I have referred to the books that I like, and like my favourite kind of things to read, as dumb guy books. And the reason that I've called them dumb guy books is because one of my favourite kinds of reading, like the favourite kind of stuff that I like to read, are things that are kind of like summer blockbuster movie style books. Like, I enjoy a thinky book. So there are many books that I've read that are, I would say, a bit more thinky. But I would say primarily the books that I read and enjoy are dewy. Now, when I'm talking about thinky versus dewy, what I want to kind of illustrate for you is that this is really a spectrum. So every book is somewhere on the line between thinky and dewy. And a thinky book, I would say, is quite ideas heavy, and a dewy book is very action and plot heavy. A book being very, very character focused could be really anywhere on the scale, but for me, I tend to prefer my books in, like, if I was going to give you this visualization of the scale here, right? I would like, if this is dewy, I want a book that's around here. So it is more about the story and more about the action and the world building than being on the far right. That's not really the right term. On the far thinky side, where the story is very much about ideas and themes and not really about telling you a story. So when I use the phrase dumb guy books, what I really mean there is it's kind of a self-disparaging term. So I'm referring to myself as the dumb guy, and what I'm talking about there is books that I think are really accessible, books that are that follow like summer blockbuster movie style structure and ideas. So if you look at something like Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, right? I would say Mistborn is very, very, very far onto the Dewey side. And I would say most Sanderson books are very Dewey. They're very much about, we're going to do this thing, and here's the thing that we're doing, and that's what we do. Sanderson books are not really about ideas, or there is a strong theme in the Stormlight Archive books around mental health. And the one of the things that I've often felt about Sanderson is that when he tries to get too themey and strays away from the plot and the action and the storytelling, which he is absolutely fantastic at, when he tries to get thinky and ideas heavy is the time where I find his writing the weakest. I think that the mental health stuff in Stormlight kind of feels like someone who has not really experienced any mental health difficulties trying to talk about mental health difficulties. And you can tell that he's done his research, you can tell he's spoken to the right people, but it's very hard to write about that because the experience of having mental health issues and problems is very singular. So one person's depression could be completely unlike another's. One person's bipolar is completely unlike another's. I have known people who have really, really, really struggled with being bipolar, and I have known people who've almost seen it as a superpower, because the troughs are not very deep, but the peaks are very high for them. And it really, really depends on 10 million different factors. And for me, the depiction of mental illness did not feel accurate to my personal experiences. Not that I can talk about having things like multiple personality disorder, but there are definitely, I think there's definitely a little bit lacking in the way that Sanderson does that stuff. And for me, there's kind of, like I was saying, the spectrum between Dewey and Thinky. And a Dewey book would be something like Mistborn. So when you read Mistborn, one of the big things, and this is something Sanderson talks about in his writing course, is like delivering on promises through storytelling and plot. And for something like Mistborn, the storytelling and the actual story being told is very much about, we're doing a heist, we're rebelling against the Lord Ruler, we're doing the My Fair Lady subplot, kind of main plot, I guess, with Vin. So the book is fairly split around those things. And we do have that background theme of like rebellion, I guess. But I would say that it's very much in the background. It's not like a foreground part of that story. And then if we look at some other books that I have read recently, so I'm just looking at the shelf now. So Wheel of Time, I would say, is closer to the Dewey side than it is to the Thinky side, but it is still, there are still ideas and themes that Jordan wants you to think about. The majority of the theming, and I would say the more overt stuff in Jordan's work is about gender politics. And I think that this stems from him originally being like, well, I'm doing a Lord of the Rings, but I want to make Gandalf a woman, and I want to make her a kind of political actor, a untrustworthy character. And then his depiction of Moraine kind of spans out into the rest of the world. So because she is the most important female character you meet early on in the series, the way that he views her kind of shows you the way that he views the rest of the female characters in the series. And I think that that's been really, really interesting so far in terms of the way that he's showing his thoughts and views, I guess, on the gender divide. And I can absolutely see why you, as a reader, might not be interested in Wheel of Time because of its gender politics. I do think that this is not... I don't think that this is an overt, like, anti-feminist or, like, Jordan hates women series. Like, I really don't think that's the case. I have to finish it, obviously. I'm still only halfway through, but having read 7 books now, and 7 pretty long books, I do think that Jordan finds the female characters to be the most interesting in his stories, and he's injecting them with a lot of nuance and very strong character, which I don't feel we really see from maybe 2 of the 3 male leads. Those characters are a lot less nuanced. However, I can see why that as an idea might be unappealing, but that is also why I would say that Jordan's stuff kind of trends a little bit closer to the thinky side than Sanderson. But then you've also got some books that are like pure Dewey. So Red Rising, for example, is like a pure Dewey book. Like, things are happening, people are getting punched, people are getting shot, people are getting stabbed. That is very, like, that's very, very much on the far end. I don't think that that is a very ideas-heavy book at all. Fairly similar with Promise of Blood, actually, the first book in the Powder Mage series. So Promise of Blood is a book that I really enjoyed, and I would say that is also quite Dewey and not so thinky. Now, books that I read recently that I would say are kind of more on the other end of the spectrum. So I read Janny Wurtz's book, Curse of the Mistwraith, not far from this time last year, actually, like October, November last year. And that is a very thinky book. While a lot of interesting stuff does happen in the book, the events of the book feel a little less important to Janny Wurtz as an author than her meditations on good versus evil, dark versus light, traditional heroic versus traditional villainous roles and characters, and the kind of the slotting of people into those roles by history and by circumstance, which I think is genuinely really interesting. And I can the ideas that she presents in that book were good, and that's one of the reasons why I finished that book despite not particularly liking it, is because I was really interested in the ideas that she was posing and where she took those ideas. But for me, it was kind of off balance in that, because it was so ideas heavy, there was not much there wasn't much interesting wasn't many interesting like things happening, if that makes sense. You might think that something like Game of Thrones is quite Dewey, and action in terms of Dewey does not just mean sword fights. A kind of thrilling and riveting scene to me could be something like a political debate or a courtroom scene or an interrogation from the Empire of the Wolf, for example, or, you know, a dangerous thing like, say, climbing a mountain or sailing in a storm. Like, all of these things are really strong Dewey action scenes for me, and I feel like a book really for me needs to have progress on the promises that are made in the plot.
Hello, it's picnic time, and I'm here to talk to you about Your Paper Quest. Your Paper Quest is a bookish subscription box that is kindly sponsoring this month of content on the channel. If you subscribe to Your Paper Quest, you'll get 2 books a month of indie published fiction across a wide variety of genres and themes such as fantasy, sci-fi, horror, all that sort of stuff. You'll also get some bookish bits in the box, and maybe the best part, you'll get access to the Your Paper Quest book club, where you can talk to other subscribers about the books that you're reading, and ask questions of the authors. They'll also post a monthly interview with those authors for the subscribers to watch, and you can choose to have this box either monthly, bi-monthly or quarterly. Now, as long as you live in the UK and US, you're able to try this one out. If you're interested, you can also support the channel and get yourself a tasty discount by putting in SAM20 at the checkout. That will give you 20% off of your bookish box.
But as I've said, Dewey versus Thinky is really a spectrum. How I'm thinking about these books is less about the, I don't know if I would enjoy a book that is all go, all do, no ideas at all. A lot of the books that I read have not got strong themes. However, I do think that a theme is important and interesting in terms of how it can help you relate to a book. I've also, I don't want to read pure ideas books, and I often find that when I read a book that is closer to the thinky end of the spectrum, that I struggle with it. There are some that I have loved, like Howling Dark by Christopher Rocchio, the second book in the Sun Eater series. I would say is actually quite ideas and theme heavy. It's quite thinky, but I really enjoyed that book, and I think that it helps that Rocchio intersperses the scenes of action, of progress against the promises made by the plot. So one thing that I really struggled with the first binding was that I was reading it and going, this is really good, the writing is excellent, the kind of theme is very strong, but I don't know what's happening. I don't think anything is happening. And I got a quarter of the way through that book, 200 pages in, and I still felt like there wasn't a plot. So I felt like, for me, and this is a personal thing for me, I really struggle to get into books when they don't kind of give me a direction or a goal or something that is being worked towards. So let's look at some of my favourite stuff. So Wheel of Time, right? Book 1, Eye of the World, the village is attacked. We have to go from the village to Tarvalon to see which one of these kids is the Dragon Reborn. Look at, Mistborn, Final Empire, we were talking about it earlier on. We have to gather together a crew, and this crew is going to rob the Lord Ruler. And other stuff as well, like Red Rising. So like I said, Red Rising is very, very plot, very Dewey, very plot heavy. And that one really sets out quite quickly what is happening. So it's Darrow is infiltrating the Reds. Darrow needs to win the Academy. Darrow needs to be the best. But then if you look at more thinky books, so Howling Dark does set you out with quite an interesting premise straight at the beginning. So one of the reasons I think that book really worked for me is that it did set out a strong direction and plot, and then it paid off on that and gave us progress throughout the book. So even when Rocchio kind of stops, sits down and wants to go through a load of ideas, all the ideas that he's talking about are progressing the plot. So when Hadrian meets with Brethren, if you've read the book, you'll know what that is. If you haven't, it isn't a spoiler really. I don't think that could spoil you in any way. When Hadrian meets with Brethren, there are some big ideas happening in that scene, and there's some really strong theming of the stuff we've been talking about in Sun Eater, which is like machine versus man and artificial intelligence and things like that. And though that section is extremely ideas heavy, however, it constantly is pushing the plot forwards. And that's why that book works so well. And if you look at something like Curse of the Mistwraith, so Curse of the Mistwraith does have what I would say is a bit of a meandering plot. So sometimes the plot will kind of fade into the background, and so that it could be more about the discussions around like the themes of light versus dark and stuff like that. Whereas the when it comes to the scenes where there's some big plot progress happening, those work really, really well. So my favorite section of the book is when there's a big kind of political section where there's a lot of political maneuvering, and you see the traditional character roles of Lysander and do you know what? I actually can't remember their name. Arathon and Lycia, I want to say. Arathon's the main character, basically. And the traditional character roles between the two are kind of reversed. And I found that to be really interesting. So there's lots going on in these books that works. And when the kind of progress in the storytelling is combined with the big ideas, I love it. I'm a huge fan of this. But when you give me like these pure ideas sections, or like I talked about with the first binding, how that book felt a lot like no story, only vibes. And if I had the story first, so one of the things in First Binding is it has this framing narrative, which is similar to Patrick Rothfuss's Name of the Wind, which is, I imagine, why a lot of people are heavily comparing the two series and saying that First Binding is derivative, is because they're using a similar framing narrative, which, you know, it's not Rothfuss's exclusive right to use that. However, so you've got this framing narrative, right? And the framing narrative takes a very long time to set up in First Binding, whereas in the Kingkiller Chronicles, it's quite short. And then when you switch out of the framing narrative and into the flashback, I feel like if I had the flashback first, the story would have been, the plot would have been much clearer to me, and I would have been invested. Whereas if I'm not getting an inciting event that invests me in the story until 200 pages in, that's kind of already too far, and there's already a lot of stuff that I've not been invested in that I might even have just like, you know, when it comes to some stuff where it's really ideas heavy without that plot progress, it kind of, you know, fades into the background in my memory, and it's harder for me to recall what's happened in those earlier sections. And like one of the big things as well in the First Binding is it starts out with like a big like storytelling, like singing section, and like that's not that was not really very helpful for me in terms of getting me invested in the plot of the characters on screen, on page. Like, it's very interesting, and I think that the giving you a plot out of the gate and making some progress towards it with every chapter is why I like books like Dresden Files, why I like books like Ryan Carhill's books from Bound and the Broken. All of those books have some really interesting themes and ideas going on, but they are present with that progress towards an end goal. So Dresden always has an end goal in every single book, and he might have setbacks, he might have huge leaps forward, but each chapter kind of relates something in terms of his progress towards really realizing that goal. Whether that progress ends up being, oh, I actually couldn't do that, or that progress ends up being, I've found a sneaky way to do this without anyone knowing, you know? And it's why storylines like heists work really well, because obviously the goal of the heist is to heist something. And yeah, I think it's very hard for me to fully and accurately articulate this. So this has kind of just been a bit of a word vomit on kind of like plot and progress and payoff and my opinion between, you know, doey books and thinky books. And like I was saying, I don't know if I want a pure Dewey book, which something like Red Rising is very close to pure Dewey. But I do really like books that err on that side of the spectrum. Something that sits right in the middle, I would probably also really enjoy. However, I think that something that is a little bit more concerned with the story and the plot and giving us that goal to work towards, that for me is one of the most interesting parts of reading. So I hope you've enjoyed this rambling word vomit of a video. I hope that you are reading some fantastic books, whether they are Dewey or they're thinky. Comment down below any books that you think are really Dewey or really thinky. And of course, if you want my opinion on whether a book is Dewey or thinky, ask me in the comments down below and I will give you a definitive judgment. Is this book Dewey? Is this book thinky? Is it a thinky do? Which I guess is what we'll call the middle. If you like this video, give it a like. If you have anything else you want to talk about in the comments, please do so down below. Although I would love to get a big chat going on of you guys asking me books, whether they're Dewey or thinky. That'd be fun. Credits to the Fire Escape podcast for coming up with the Dewey thinky spectrum. It's a video game podcast that I listen to that I really enjoy. And so yeah, Dewey thinky is not my idea, but this is I'm kind of applying the spectrum to books, which is funny because they on Fire Escape use thinky as like talky and reading heavy, but obviously all books are reading heavy. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. We've now hit 1,000 subscribers, so we will be doing our subscriber TBR in October, and I will put details up towards the end of the month as what that's going to be. Thanks so much for watching today, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.